I'm Kwame Anthony Appiah. I teach philosophy at NYU in the college and the law school, and I'm this year's recipient of the Kluge Prize. Human lives are made as men and women and non-binary people, and as blacks and whites and Asians, and as gay and straight and bisexual and people and so on, as Ghanaians, as Americans, as Catholics, as Protestants. And these identities are really central to making a life, and therefore to making a decent life, making a life that's a successful life. And just sort of thinking about that, I'm not saying nobody had ever said anything relevant to this before. Aristotle said things that are relevant to this. John Stuart Mill said things that are relevant to this. But putting it together as a package required the availability of the concept of identity, and that's what I tried to do.
Anthony Appiah is the embodiment of a liberal spirit, someone who's open to the other person's argument, who knows how to speak with everyone, who knows how to write toward everyone. And that is a very, very rare thing.
I was convinced right away that Anthony Appiah should have and would have a much larger audience, and that his mandate was vastly larger, that it was universal, in fact. And virtually from the beginning of our relationship, and we met 51 years ago this October, I felt that Kwame Anthony Appiah had a message to give to the world. And you know what? I was right about that.
I think it's been the bane of the Academy, and maybe a parody of the Academy in the Humanities for many years now, that writing has become more and more convoluted and almost assertively difficult to understand. And in some fields you can almost understand that because you can't avoid a technical vocabulary in some things. Anthony Appiah is a philosopher with a deep understanding of the mathematics and logic part of philosophy as well. And yet when you read him, his prose is as clear as gin. As clear as gin. And if you're just beginning to read Anthony and looking for books to read, I think you could do a lot worse than starting with My Father's House, which is both a matter of memoir and an exploration of what race isn't as well as is. And in fact, Anthony, on many levels, has grappled with the idea that there is no such thing as race, which is a source of deep study for him.
So it's important to know that in the late 20th century, and even to this day, Anglophone philosophy has been dominated by an approach called analytic philosophy. Now, analytic philosophy analyzes things. So the sense of analysis is you break something big down into small parts, and you come to understand them, and then you put them back in good order. And so that's what analytic philosophers try to do. And a lot of what they focused on is philosophy of language, because you're trying to understand how language works and the presuppositions of our language about the way the world is. So Anthony started out doing philosophy of language in this analytic tradition. In the mid-1980s, he published work in analytic philosophy of language, and it was really important and really excellent. But at the same time, he was doing work in cultural studies kind of on the side and beginning to publish on race and ethnicity and the very idea of Africa. And then around 1990, he began to switch more substantially into doing what we might call social political philosophy, moral philosophy, and philosophy of culture. And in this shift, he was beginning to think much more deeply about how race and identity sort of frame our lives, how ethnicity, how gender, these all provide framing conditions for the lives that we live together and our interactions with each other. And so questions become things like, so are these identities something that are going to promote social justice? Do we need to hold on to these identities in order to achieve fairness? Or should we dispense with these identities? And these questions are exactly the questions that we're still asking today.
Something that's very interesting about Anthony as a teacher is even when there are unbelievably controversial matters in the air, Anthony knows how to take on a group of people and find ways to speak with them and listen to them. And by listening to them and speaking with them in the way he does, I think almost uniquely, this is deep in his personality, deep in his approach to intellectual and social life. And God knows we could use a lot more of it in this world.
Anthony Appiah is my ideal of a humanist. What that means, both in terms of serious scholarship and in terms of what he is committed to providing to the public at large. But it's his way of thinking that makes him so powerful and so unique. It is the idea of a humanist that spills over all disciplinary boundaries. They simply are irrelevant. They're not even in the way. They're irrelevant for Anthony's magisterial work. His breadth of interest and way to use all that material to help us understand the richness and diversity of human experience is so powerful and so completely on message, both for what humanities stand for and for what libraries stand for. We're grateful that he doesn't just espouse cosmopolitanism. He embodies it. He lives it. He celebrates it, and he inspires us to do the same.
When you're in the presence of Anthony Appiah, right away, two words occur. Intellectual elegance, in the sense of a solution to a complex physics problem, that the solution was elegant. He is the most intelligent person I have ever met. He is truly a genius, and I love to be in his company. I learned so much. I love the way that his mind unfolds a problem.
I've never met a better, sweeter, warmer human being than Anthony Appiah. So any award he gets is fine by me, but he's also way up there on the human scale. I adore him.
On behalf of all of us in New York, at the New York Public Library, at Princeton, all of your friends and admirers, huge congratulations, Anthony, on this so well-deserved, amazing prize.
I am so grateful to you, Anthony, for all that you've done. It's just been brilliant and moving, and it powerfully affects so many people. I'm speaking about myself, but I know I speak for so many. So thank you so much.
Kwame, congratulations from the bottom of my heart upon receiving this signal honor in your career, an honor that would seem to have been made specifically for you, my friend. I can't wait to raise a glass or two in the best tradition of our days at Clare College.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the director of the John W. Kluge Center, Dr. Kevin Butterfield.
Good evening. Dr. Hayden, members of the Madison Council, members of our Scholars Council, Kluge Center chairs and fellows, our many distinguished guests. Welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Building at the Library of Congress for the conferral of the John W. Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity. All of us at the Library of Congress are honored that you have joined us to recognize the work of a truly distinguished philosopher and educator. The John W. Kluge Prize honors work of the highest quality and greatest influence, work that advances our understanding of the human experience. And that phrase, that understanding of the human experience, could not fit the work of our honoree tonight, Kwame Anthony Appiah, more perfectly. Dr. Appiah's distinguished career is a continued probing into the central questions of humanity: who we are, what is important to us, how we understand ourselves and one another. He asks serious questions about what obligations we have to one another, friends and strangers, and he helps us to think through answers to those questions. And as Dr. Appiah's peers have just reminded us, It's even more notable that he can write about complex topics in a way that is clear, approachable, engaging, bringing in new readers to broaden their own understandings of humanity. It's no surprise that when asked to title his collaborative work with the Library of Congress connected with this prize, work that will continue into 2025, he chose the title Thinking Together. We are to ask and to seek answers to questions about ourselves and our world in conversation with one another, and as libraries make possible, in conversation with all those who came before us. As of this evening, the Kluge Prize will have been awarded to 14 world-class scholars who over a sustained period throughout their careers distilled wisdom from the cumulative record of human experience and have helped to give shape to public life. Coincidentally enough, it will be the 14th Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden, conferring this award on the 14th Kluge Prize recipient. How do we get here? The library solicits nominations from thousands of national and international institutions and esteemed individuals, following a rigorous selection process involving curators, librarians, specialists from our staff, as well as a distinguished panel of some of the world's leading scholars, nearly all of whom are here tonight. The librarian makes a final decision. And selection is based on 3 factors: deep intellectual achievement in the study of humanity, the creation of scholarship that has had influence on public affairs, civil society, and third, it's intended for scholars who possess that rare ability to communicate the meaning, the significance, transformative potential of their work to people across the nation and around the world. The late John W. Kluge made an extraordinary impact on America's oldest federal cultural institution when he created the endowment that funds this prize and that funds the research of the many scholars who spend time in residence at the Kluge Center here in the Jefferson Building. We are deeply grateful for his generosity. Over the past 24 years, the center has welcomed more than 1,000 scholars from around the world to study in our vast collections, to share their work with and ask questions of one another, and to interact with congressional members and staff and with the American public. Many of those scholars are here with us tonight, and we celebrate them and their work as we do Dr. Appia and his. The American founding generation knew, as George Washington said in his first message to Congress, that knowledge is in every country the surest basis of public happiness. We too know this to be true, and indeed a commitment to that idea is the foundation on which the Library of Congress, and within it, the John W. Kluge Center rests. We also know that the pursuit of knowledge, like the pursuit of happiness, can take us down unexpected and wide-ranging paths. We know that, as Thomas Jefferson wrote as he prepared to deliver his personal library to become Congress's library, that there is in fact no subject to which a member of Congress may not have occasion to refer. An idea that still shapes the library's acquisitions policies and is in many ways a guiding principle that brings us together here tonight. For an embrace of that breadth of inquiry is a perfect description of the John W. Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity, and it is of course also a wonderful description of tonight's recipient. It's my great pleasure now to invite the 14th Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden, to confer the 2024 Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity.
And thank you, Kevin. Scholars, colleagues, friends, distinguished guests, we are so very pleased to have you here with us this evening. Welcome to the Library of Congress. Welcome to a celebration of scholarship that has advanced our understanding of humanity, the Kluge Prize. When philanthropist John W. Kluge created this prize, as well as the Kluge Center, it gave the Library of Congress an opportunity to honor scholars of tremendous stature, whose work and career have had a profound effect on a civil society across the globe. Recipients have included John Hope Franklin, Daniel Allen, Drew Gilpin Faust, Charles Taylor, and most recently, George Chauncey. You may clap. And tonight, it is my great privilege to confer the 2024 Kluge Prize upon Kwame Anthony Appiah. He is internationally recognized for his work at the intersection of analytical philosophy, ethics, identity, and race. And in his work, he deals with the issues at the heart of some of our most contentious public debates. He has examined how societies undergo, quote, moral revolution and turn against practices that were once considered acceptable. His explorations of African and African American experience and history have been enormously influential, greatly influencing and enhancing our understanding of the world in which we live. He has written extensively on the concept of identity, how we understand and define ourselves and others. His work on cosmopolitanism, I practiced that one, particularly is essential for understanding a world where an awe-inspiring level of international connection is possible, even as animosity based on race, nation, and religion appears as threatening as ever. He asks difficult questions, and he asks us to think together about them. And so, for his distinguished career and continued grappling with some of the toughest questions humanity has ever sought to answer, he is richly deserving of this prize. And so, I would ask Professor Kwame Anthony Appiah, please come forward to receive the 2024 Kluge Prize for Achievement for the Study of Humanity.
I'm taking the risk here of doing this on this fine machine. I once gave a talk on an iPad, a commencement address at President Obama's alma mater. And halfway through, the machine said at the bottom of the screen, overheating, turning down. But fortunately, there was a very wise woman behind me, a woman who had who worked for the president of the institution, who had asked me if I wouldn't mind just giving her a paper copy. And when this happened, I looked sort of panicked, and she'd been following along on the paper, and she just handed me the paper copy, which is why there's a paper copy in my husband's pocket. All right. So I've got to begin, of course, by thanking the library and the librarian of Congress and all those who advised them, many of whom are here, for granting me this great honor. And I'm grateful, too, to the leadership and the staff of the Kluge Center, who have worked so hard to put together this extraordinary evening, which, as you can imagine, I'm kind of enjoying. Moments like this elicit a sort of dual consciousness. On the one hand, here I am watching a video in which someone who looks remarkably like me is being celebrated, and I'm thinking, gosh, I wish I could meet that fellow. He seems to have done some interesting stuff. On the other hand, most of the time we are fixed in an insider's view, a first-person perspective on our daily existence. But the truth is that we're all capable of taking this third-person perspective on ourselves and our doings. We can see ourselves as situated in time and place with a lot of history behind us and a lot of history ahead of us, at least we hope. It's a simple thought, but the fact that human beings have the capacity to alternate between such perspectives has informed a great deal of my past and present work, including questions that I've been thinking about most recently. These questions, for better or worse, have a particular claim on our concern these days as we find ourselves in a republic that can seem so venomously divided. And so tonight, in my first outing as the Kluge Laureate, I want to make the case for the power of thinking in the third person. Start with the very concept of identity, which, as my friends have said, is one that I have thought about. In a very early paper of mine, published nearly 40 years ago, that's the sort of thing academics say, in a very early paper, I made what I imagined was the uncontentious point that our usual conception of race was incoherent, that there wasn't anything that could do for us all the things we asked the word race to do. Nothing could do that. After the paper came out, something of a firestorm, or at least the more genteel academic equivalent of a firestorm, erupted. If you've been subject to a racist attack, nothing might feel more real than race. And some people felt that in arguing for the unreality of race, I was subtracting from the reality of their experiences. Well, as I later observed, the concept of race might be a unicorn, but its horn can still draw blood, real blood. Well, of course, in the life cycle of an academic argument, positions often go from being too preposterous to entertain to being too obvious to remark without a stop in between. So in the blink of an eye, the response changes from, "You can't say that," to, "That goes without saying," which is sort of what happened here, because the observation I made is no longer contentious in the humanities, I think. In time, though, I saw value in reframing the discussion in terms of the more abstract concept of social identity. So what if we think of race as a kind of social identity, a phenomenon to take its place alongside a plenitude of other identities, each with points of commonality and distinction? What does this third-person vantage enable us to see? Our first-person perspectives, our lived experiences, will always be vivid to us. This is who and what I am. People will live their lives with main character energy. But with a little more work, we can also view ourselves, the way historians and social scientists might, as shaped by larger forces, bound by a culture's pre-written scripts. We can see ourselves as historical creatures, as an inheritor and an inhabitant of various identities, and therefore as a person like every other. From the first-person perspective, the scripts of identity often stay below consciousness. We're black or gay, a woman, trans, Latino, a conservative, a Mormon, perhaps in some combination, and we experience these things as essential dimensions of our selfhood, but they're things we live rather than things we think about. In video game terms, you might say, we're never a non-playable character to ourselves. But when you see these labels through the conceptual lens of identity, certain possibilities present themselves. Once you fully apprehend an identity as an identity, that is, you can see it is something historically mutable and contingent. Not less powerful, but perhaps less permanent. Perhaps something you might join with others to try to renegotiate. And perhaps at a certain level of abstraction, a version of something that everybody else has too. So, in The Ethics of Identity in 2005 and in The Lies That Bind in 2018, the latter subtitled Rethinking Identity, I wrote about the overlapping and intersecting social identities we live with and through, nationality, race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and the like, and offered a general theory about what constituted them. One lesson was that we can be subjects of an identity without being wholly controlled by it, precisely because we recognize it as an identity. We can live it from the inside, but see it from the outside as well. We can learn to think in the third person. I'm not claiming that we can calm the so-called identity wars by a simple act of intellectual discipline, taking the third person point of view. But lest you dismiss all this as merely academic in the pejorative sense, I want to insist that the human capacity to think in the third person, to abstract away from our individual particularity in our own perspective, has proved immensely powerful in our social and political history. Consider the development of liberal toleration in early modern Europe. Religious tolerance requires you to see what you're tolerating as, in fact, a religion. That abstract category did real work, and it hadn't been around very long. No word in the biblical scriptures or in the Quran quite corresponds to our concept of religion. I once asked a sheikh, I was teaching in Abu Dhabi, to come to talk to my class about religion, and I said, when we're talking about religion, and he came in and he talked about monotheism, because that was his concept. But of course, our notion of religion is much bigger than that. An active imagination, in other words, is required to conceptualize other people's sacred beliefs and practices as religions rather than just as heresies or mistakes, just as error. And the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, Augsburg for the Germanists in the room, resolved religious conflict by allowing Protestants of various denominations and Catholics as well to see their religion as a religion among others, while not abandoning their own faith. That was just a start. But over the next centuries, societies confronted by internal diversity increasingly accepted that others were entitled to live by their own understandings. But to do that, you had to adopt an outside perspective and see your own understanding as one understanding among others. And that slow revolution changed everything. So pluralism begins with plural nouns, not religion, but religions. Indeed, religion, like identity, really only makes sense in the plural. We must be convinced that all these shockingly different things are, in some respect, the same kind of thing. Abstraction isn't merely subtraction. What rang down the curtain on a long, unbelievably bloody era of religious warfare in Europe then was a form of tolerance that required stepping outside yourself. Thinking in the third person can change history. Consider what the philosopher Peter Singer has called morality's expanding circle, the process in which the care and concern we direct towards members of an in-group, our kin and kith, become extended outward and outward. This process has always been powered by thinking in the third person. Seeing oneself as an object makes it easier to see other living beings as subjects too. Today, as social media feeds our snarling outrage and starves the quieter stirrings of our humanity, we've increasingly allowed partisan political identities to control us. When we forget to think in the third person, dialogue can desiccate into acrid debate. Taking that third person perspective on myself, I realized that my attitudes to all this have been shaped by my own background. My parents, for example, were deeply enmeshed in the independence movements that in the middle of the past century swept across the African continent. My father was a roommate and one-time intimate of Kwame Nkrumah, who was to be Ghana's first head of state, and he had been friendly with Jomo Kenyatta and Leopold Sedar Senghor and many others who would also go on to lead other newly independent African states. He was equally devoted to a Pan-African ideal. West Indian activists and intellectuals like George Padmore and C.L.R. James dined at our table in Kumasi when I was a child. The American novelist Richard Wright, representing Afro-America, came knocking. And in his book, Black Power, he wrote some rather unflattering things about my great-uncle. It was an era of so much hope and so much heartbreak. Independence leaders who spoke the language of liberty often switched, once in power, to dark talk of sedition, something Americans might recognize. After my father broke with the president and helped found an opposition party, he wound up as a political prisoner, and some of his dearest friends died in custody. Nkrumah soon banned opposition parties completely and decreed himself president for life. Convinced of his infallibility, he viewed political dissenters in the manner of a church that sees other faiths only as heresies. So that's a point at which thinking in the third person would have been useful for the first president of Ghana. But now a thorny question arises. We all have our political convictions, or at least we should have. If we held them lightly, they wouldn't be convictions. So how can we be guided by convictions and remain aware that we're historical subjects shaped by forces and contexts that we can't transcend? The answer starts, I think, with the recognition that thinking in the third person doesn't impoverish the first person, it enriches it. Because that practice sponsors an epistemic habit that philosophers call fallibilism. Michel de Montaigne, a favorite teacher of mine, libraries make it possible that you have favorite teachers who are long dead, writing a quarter of a century after Augsburg, captured this idea in an essay he wrote, a very famous essay, after reflecting on what he had heard about the cultures of the Americas as Europeans found and then conquered them. Quote, "I find that there is nothing barbarous or savage in that nation, as far as what I have been told is concerned, except that everyone calls barbarous everything that is not their own custom. And he went on, it seems that we have no better lens for viewing truth and reason than the example and the idea given us by the opinions and customs of the country where we live. And he wasn't commending that. The liberal fallibilism he espoused was the need to recognize from that outsider's perspective that one is subject to the same tendency to error that one can see so easily, so much more easily, in others. In New Testament terms, motes and beams. Some of the ancient skeptics had concluded from this that one should avoid belief, suspend judgment. But Montaigne's more reasonable view was that we should use our natural capacities to form judgments while remaining always open to the possibility that we are wrong. You can speak with confidence so long as you keep your ears open to the voices of demurral and dissent. And this fallibilism, please note, is an ally, not an enemy, of the idea of truth. It's simply the recognition that truth is hard to find. It urges modesty and care in making claims about truth. The best pictures we have of the world, all the scientific, social, and moral models available to us, will always be flawed, and yet they are all we have. As I argued in the 2017 book, As If, Idealizations and Ideals, much of our best theory consists of, and is known to consist of, idealizations, which is to say, useful fictions. Once we come to see that many of our best theories are idealizations, I wrote, we will see why our best chance of understanding the world must be to have a plurality of ways of thinking about it. That's why theoretical monism, the idea that there's only one general theory of everything, is a mistake. We need many maps of reality, each imperfect, each illuminating. Notice that this isn't a theory about the universe exactly, it's a theory about us, about how we, fallible humans, can best make sense of the world we all inhabit. A novelist friend of mine, the late Ed Doctorow, once remarked that writing for him was like driving a car at night. You can see only as far as your headlights, but you can still make the whole trip that way. Living in the first person is like that. It's just that we can imagine ourselves into other perspectives. We can try to scrutinize, as it were, the headlights we are seeing by. We can visualize our car as one among many, some with different itineraries or headed to shared destinations by different routes. Well, so much for metaphorical car rides. Allow me to tell you in closing about a literal long drive I once took with a neighbor of my English grandmother's. He was an extremely right-wing member of the English Parliament, and you might have thought the cordiality between him and my grandmother was curious because she had married into one of the great English families of the left, filled with Labour Party luminaries. My great-grandfather had the unfortunate job of being the first Labour leader of the House of Lords at a time when there were only about 6 members of that body that thought socialism was a good idea. So anyway, what's more, our neighbour was a close ally of Enoch Powell, an MP who railed against non-white immigration in ways that we recognized as racist. But perhaps because he and his wife had no children of their own, our neighbour took it upon himself to be a kind of mentor to me. He taught me things he might have taught a son or grandson. He taught me how to fish for trout with some success. He showed me how to box with less success. He even helped me pick my college at Cambridge, his college, the college at which I met Skip, Clare College, and he drove me across England to visit it because my parents were in Ghana. On the way back from that visit to Cambridge that set my academic path, and I have been an undergraduate, a graduate student, a fellow, and now an honorary fellow of Clare College, all due to him, we argued for hours. He was about to vote on a bill in Parliament that would have reintroduced capital punishment. I made the case passionately against that. He, who had practiced as a lawyer, he was a Queen's Counsel, rebutted vigorously. As I look around at the political divisions of the country that has become mine, I wonder what most of my fellow Americans would make of the sight of a young brown man with a great mop of hair, alas, long gone, and a subscription, as I then had, to the Soviet News, because I wanted to annoy my teachers, seated by a balding white fellow who was as solid a conservative as Britain could produce, talking for hours about politics without one word spoken in anger or resentment. Neither of us changed each other's mind that day. At the end of the journey, as we arrived back home, he announced, genially and generously, clambering out of the car, "Well, you won all the arguments today, Anthony, but I'm not switching my vote." Is that troubling? Well, only if you have a narrowly instrumental view of conversation. Some people do. They think of conversation as conversion. But in truth, the ability to have the conversation amid disagreement is precisely what enables us to share and help steer a republic together. The trouble doesn't come when we disagree, that's inevitable. The trouble comes when conversation is edged by another sentiment, die heretic. When differences of partisan identity swamp all the other identities, including our shared American identity, that we have in common. We must be able to fight for what we believe in. We must try to prevail in the political arena without sinking to cast out everyone who disagrees. And that human ability to think in the third person helps keep that car on the road. Our differences are real. Gender, sexuality, color, class, creed, country, culture, all such categories can bring some people together and keep others apart. You must look at the world from somewhere and as someone, a person with a specific set of identities, a perspective. Yet you also have the capacity as a human being to stand at a certain distance from yourself and grasp that you are a person among persons and that others like you may be entitled to make their lives in the light of their own aims and their own understandings. Once that happens, there are conversations to be had, and in the first person. As we gather here in this great and magnificently cosmopolitan library, this cathedral to human curiosity, erudition, and imagination, my greatest hope is that we will all be able to continue these conversations, maybe even tonight. Thank you very much.